Adirondack Explorer. Welcome and thank you for getting up so early to join us for this discussion of the use of road salt in the Adirondacks. We know it's August, but before you know it, the trucks are going to be back out again, spreading salt on the highways, an ongoing threat to our Adirondack waters, as well as people's drinking water. The use of road salt has been of concern here for almost 40 years, and we still await significant action from the state. Here to talk about it are Rivard and Dan Kelting. They'll talk for about a half hour, and then we'll take some of your questions. We've already gotten some over email, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to add your questions. Dan heads the Adirondack Watershed Institute at Paul Smith College. He's been studying road salt for nearly a decade. His latest study of Adirondack wells revealed that 55% of those downslope from state roads contain sodium levels above the federal guideline. Rye is water reporter for the Adirondack Explorer. He comes to the Explorer from San Diego, where he covered water and energy for the nonprofit publication Voice of San Diego. He spent much of this year traveling the park, talking to people who have been adversely affected by the state's heavy use of road salt, some whom are drinking bottled water because their wells have been poisoned by salt, and others who face financial ruin. And as Rye will explain, there's almost no recourse for them. Dan, Rye, welcome. Rye and Dan will bring us up to date on where the road salt issue stands, including recently passed state legislation to form a task force to study salt. It's currently awaiting the governor's signature. Dan, Rye.
Thank you.
Good morning. Dan, before we start, maybe we'll just, what are we talking about? What is road salt? Is it what I'm putting on my eggs in the morning? What are we talking about? What is this chemical?
Yeah, so road salt, or also commonly called rock salt, is a naturally occurring mineral. It's halite. I actually have the formula on my board here. Na is sodium and Cl is chloride. So when we're talking about road salt, we're talking about sodium chloride. It is in fact the same salt, the Morton salt you put on your eggs and a lot of other things. I'm a big, probably use too much salt, but it's the same exact salt except minus the iodide with which they add to the salt that you buy at the store. So,
and let's talk about maybe that first, and then we'll get into sort of how it ended up on the roads. But so we've all heard about the health effects of regular salt, and so let's talk about the stakes here. So road salt, you're putting salt on the road, then it ends up in a water supply. We'll get to how you found that out. But what does that mean when it ends up in a water supply? Is it as bad as having too much salt in the morning for breakfast and then for lunch and then for dinner?
Right. So having salt in your water supply and this is particularly the sodium component. So for individuals that are on low salt diets and they have hypertension or other health-related issues, they're on a sodium restricted diet. Those individuals are at risk from consuming too much salt, and so the federal EPA has a limit on the sodium concentration, amount of sodium that those on the sodium restricted diet can consume, and that concentration limit is 20 parts per million. So meaning that those individuals who are drinking water with a higher concentration than that are putting themselves at greater risk. And what the issue there is, Rye, is they're not even going to know it because you can't taste 20 parts per million of salt. You can't even taste 60. So you may be, unbeknownst to yourself, drinking water that has a high sodium concentration, and you're trying to budget your salt intake through your food. You're not thinking about your water because we're all told to drink lots of water. So that's the issue, is primarily for folks that are on these restricted diets for a variety of health reasons, and typically older individuals.
Yeah, I interviewed somebody, a family farm out in Boonville, just sort of outside of the park, And if you looked at one of the samples of that showed the salt concentration in their water, the wife, Mrs. Sweeney, was drinking, she drinks about a gallon a day of water, and started to notice health problems. And I sort of did this calculation, as anybody can do, converting the sample, the amount of sodium that would be in a liter of water to a gallon, which she estimated she was drinking. And she was getting darn near the upper end of a low sodium diet's intake full of salt, just drinking that water on top of, they like donuts, they like bacon, they have bacon every Sunday, which has salt in it. So she was blowing past what any doctor would recommend for somebody with hypertension, which she ended up having. She ended up having a stroke at one point. That's just one example. How did you start studying this? When did you think, I need to figure out how much salt is going in water supplies?
Right.
Was this like a decade ago?
Yeah, so actually in just over a decade ago, we, Watershed Institute, myself and my colleague Corey Laxon, we were approached by Adirondack Council and ADK Action, two of our regional NGOs here in the Adirondacks that are also very concerned about human health and the environment. And so they asked us if we would do basically a literature review and write a white paper on the environmental and human health effects of salt, and also best management practices for reducing the impacts of salt on the environment and human health. And so that's how we got into it, is starting to review the literature. And then we quickly realized that, hey, we don't have to review the literature, we can create literature. So we at the Watershed Institute, we operate the largest surface water monitoring network in the Adirondacks, the Adirondack Lakes Assessment Program, in partnership with Protect the Adirondacks. And so we have a large data set of water samples, if you will, available. So we started to look at that data to see what the salt concentrations were in Adirondack waters, first in lakes and then in streams, and ultimately that led us to look at groundwater. So it was an evolution, if you will, of starting with the literature review and then realizing that indeed we had local data to bring to bear on the issue, and then we started publishing and talking to folks about it and sharing our data.
And how many wells have you tested at this point, and what have you found in the wells that you've tested?
So we've tested over 500 wells to date, and actually there's Tracy, if you want to pop up one of those, there's like a couple of bar charts if you want to show those. Down, keep going. Next one. There, next one. Perfect, you popped up, yeah, good. So Ryan is asking about this well study. So we, several years ago, 3 years ago to be exact, we conducted really a grassroots study. It was sponsored by the Cloud Splitter Foundation and also the Fund for Lake George and some other private donations. And we asked folks to participate as volunteers to send us water samples from their wells throughout the Adirondacks. We actually would mail them a sample kit. And so we have well over 500 wells sampled to date, and we've actually closed out the project. We're not accepting any more samples for this particular study. But we have 500 wells throughout the Adirondacks, and what we did is we were able to determine just by elevation. So you got the road here, is the well downslope from the road, is it upslope from the road? So we're able to classify the wells into 3 different groupings: wells that don't receive any road runoff, so they're upslope and away from a road; wells that receive runoff from what we call local roads, or roads that are maintained by our towns, our villages, our counties, our local municipalities; and then wells that are downslope of our state highways, ones that are maintained in winter by either straight directly by the DOT or under contract with others. So this is our Route 3s, our Route 30s, our US 9, our interstate, those roads. And so what we found was quite striking in terms of the results. So here you're looking at our sodium and our chloride, are the 2 components of our road salt or rock salt. And so if you look at sodium, So these numbers, the bars, or the height of the bar is the median. So the median value for each type. So if you look at the wells that are upslope and away from roads for sodium, we see there's less than 5, or about 3 parts per million of sodium on average in those wells, and it's a pretty tight number. It doesn't vary much. If you look all the way over to the other chart for chloride, you can barely see the bar just barely shows up. And so why is that? We don't have in the Adirondack. So where does chloride, where do these things come from? Sodium and chloride comes largely from the rock. So as the rock weathers, it releases these elements. And so our geology just doesn't have much chloride in it, if any, really. It's coming from the rain. So we have very little chloride. When we look at the local wells that are downslope of local roads, we see that they're higher. So a couple of times higher for sodium and about 8 times higher for chloride, but we're looking at about 6 parts per million for sodium and roughly about the same, about 6 parts per million for chloride. It's a little bit higher.
Which isn't dangerous though. That wouldn't be dangerous to anybody drinking.
And then when we look at the state, it's dramatic. So we have the average of sodium in the wells. So this is state wells about 160 or so. Average is 33. So on average, 33. The average is 33. We talked about the standard is 20. So the average is greater than the standard, 11 times higher than local roads. We look at chloride, the average is 100. So that's 100 times higher, so dramatically higher on average for both sodium and chloride for wells that are downslope of state roads. And so why do we have this stark difference? It goes to how these roads are managed in the wintertime. So our local roads these are our county roads, our town roads, our village roads. These are typically our lower traffic, lower speed roads. Most of these roads are maintained in winter using sand with a little bit of salt, maybe 5 to 10% salt mixed in, but primarily sand to be used as abrasive. And so the amount of salt going down on those roads is quite low. The state highways are being treated with salt. So that's the primary mechanism, primary treatment along with plowing that is used to prevent icing, prevent bonding of snow and ice to the road surface to facilitate plowing. And those roads receive on average about 225 pounds every time they apply. Pass over a mile, about 225 pounds per lane mile, or 450 pounds per actual road mile.
Right, a lane mile is a mile on each side of the road for people that don't know DOT speak. Yeah.
DOT speak, right. So 450 pounds every trip, or about 30 tons per mile every winter. So that's the stark difference there, as you're seeing. That salt, of course, is supplied to the road. It doesn't stay on the road. It runs off. It all runs off the road. Where does it go? It goes into the ground. Some stays in the soil. Some goes in the groundwater. We're seeing that reflected in people's drinking water. And then some goes into the surface water, and we're seeing that reflected in the lakes and the streams.
And so you talked about sand as an abrasive, and then you talked a little bit about salt. What is it? Why do you dump tons of salt? Why would DOT dump tons of salt on the road? What is it doing? Does it magically, kill snow? Like what's the point of it?
Snow killer. Yeah. So the DOT, so they have their job, one of their jobs, they have many jobs, is to create safe driving conditions for the driving public, both private and commercial, on the New York State highway system. And so they have what's called, the jargon would be levels of service. So the highways, the Route 30s, the Route 3s, the 86s of the world, these are our high traffic, high volume, higher speed, 55-mile-an-hour roads. And so the DOT guideline for winter management of those roads, the guidance is that within an hour and a half during the daytime, within an hour and a half of a snow event, that road will be clear. The surface of the road will be clear for driving. And so what that means is, that means is the pavement is clear. And so how the DOT does that is they need to, so when they're plowing the snow off, they want to prevent the snow from bonding to the surface and forming what we call hard pack. And so if anybody's driven on a back road, you'll see those roads are covered with snow and it's packed down. That's called hard pack. And the DOT wants to prevent that hard pack from forming on these higher speed, higher traffic roads. So the way that they do that is by using this chemical. So salt melts snow. And salt is very thirsty for water, right? You put salt in your mouth, it just sucks all the water out of your mouth. It just takes in the water. So the DOT they'll apply salt to the road before a snow event. And that creates a layer of salt on the road that prevents the snow from bonding to the road. So when the plow comes along, it's able to scrape all that snow off the road before it bonds. They call that anti-icing. They'll also come in during the event if they have to and apply salt to try to break any bonds of snow that have occurred on roads. So they use the salt as part of to meet their guideline of having the road clear within an hour and a half of an event.
And that's, it's interesting. I was just traveling in California a little bit, and you go across the West, Colorado, parts of California and around Yosemite and some of the wilderness areas there, largely federal wilderness, I think. They don't, for the most part, in the winter, they sort of seed the mountain passes and even some of the lower, I mean, they're still high elevation, but sort of lower high elevation roads to the snow. In
Right.
Colorado, there's gates. They say, we're gonna, close the road. In the Sierra Mountains of California, they'll say, don't expect us to plow here. What's the sort of difference? That's the sort of extreme end. We're gonna let the snow take over for the winter versus in the Adirondacks where it's, some people call it the bare road policy. It's gonna be blacktop all winter. What's the difference in the thinking between some of the Western wilderness and our great Eastern wilderness?
That's interesting. I've had the pleasure to spend some time out west too, and yeah, it's dramatically different in terms of I guess it would be the philosophy of how to manage the road network in the wintertime. So the legend here is widespread use of salting in the Adirondacks started around 1980. So our second Winter Olympics to create safe and drivable, high-speed drivable roads year-round, essentially. And so we've gotten used to that in New York and other states in the Northeast to be able to go out and drive at summer speeds in the winter. And the only way that can happen to be able to drive at those speeds is using these types of treatments, these chemicals to be able to get the snow off the road. So it's a choice, it's a choice that we're making. So out west, they've made the choice, a value judgment, I guess, in terms of what's more valuable. Perhaps maybe they're valuing protecting the environment maybe more so than we are. We're valuing the convenience of driving fast on our roads. And so that is one thing I think, Ryan, when we think about choice, we have the roads are maintained this way. It's DOT is mandated to maintain the roads this way. So they're not doing it to be environmentally negative. They're doing it because they're mandated to do it by legislation. So it's really us, the people, the drivers, who have this expectation now to be able to drive, and I'm guilty of it. I say, wow, I can get to work in 15 minutes in January because the road's clean or clear. So we're all conditioned. We're all conditioned to be able to expect to be able to drive at whatever speed we want, anytime we want. And I think people out west are just they've been conditioned differently. Oh, the gate's closed. Oh well, I can't go to Montana, or I got to pull over and put the road chains on, my chains on my tires. So it's a different mindset, a different really culturally different, I guess, in terms of our expectations for driving in the wintertime, even though we get a lot of snow.
And we still have this bar chart on the screen, but I think there's another chart that shows all the different well tests you've done. I wonder if we could maybe go to that and then talk about maybe, so we're going to be looking at, if we get it up on the screen, a bunch of dots, which are well samples all over the park. And maybe you can talk about not just the numbers, but what each one of these, there's a bunch of red dots that show exceedances of the federal standards for chloride, sodium, and drinking water, which, by the way, are federal sort of guidelines. You can't get in trouble for violating them if you're a public water system, and if you're a well owner, there's essentially no regulation of what's in your well, but there are consequences. So there are a bunch of red dots on the screen showing where you see these exceedances of sodium and chloride levels that meet, that are sort of health guidelines. What does that mean for, we talked a little bit about health effects, but there's also some effects to the plumbing, to appliances. Can you sort of go over the sort of parade of horribles that can happen if you have high sodium and high chloride in your water?
Yeah, so we talked about the sodium from the human health perspective, right? And then, so this map, just quickly about the map. So these dots, as Ry pointed out, these are wells that, the black dots are wells that were downslope of local roads that exceeded either the sodium or the chloride guideline. And the red dots are wells that are downslope of the state highways that exceeded one or two of those guidelines. And you can see they're all over the place, right? So they're not just in one location in the Adirondacks, they're throughout the region. And this is important because when we initially started showing this data, sharing it with people, the agencies particularly, they suggested that, well, these are anomalies. This is because of legacy, like, for example, salt storage used not to be covered, right? So the big salt piles are exposed to rain, and where those happen, there is significant groundwater contamination. Well, these wells are located all over the place. So they're not, most of them are not near salt storage. They're just wells randomly on the side of the road. So this is a regional phenomenon, not a local thing happening in any particular town or village or stretch of highway. So that's the map. That's what the map shows us as regional groundwater contamination. So as Ry pointed out, that so certainly we have the human health aspect, and that's really focused on sodium. But when we think about the chloride piece, the chloride standard, if you will, the 250 parts per million, is a taste. It's an aesthetic. So once people start drinking water with a chloride concentration above 250, they tend not to like the taste of it. But there's another piece of that. So chloride is corrosive. And so once you have higher chloride concentrations, so 250 is also a threshold for corrosivity. And we have wells in the Adirondacks with chloride concentrations of 1,500, 2,000 parts per million. So some of those red dots on there are 700, 1,000, 1,500. So what's happening to folks plumbing? Well, a few things. One is if they have old plumbing, so old lead-based, old lead solder plumbing from an older home, they're actually leaching heavy metals and lead into their water. This is something that happened in Flint, Michigan. Back folks are probably aware of that story. folks are getting lead contamination.
Yeah,
But
let's
even,
just for a second, Dan, let's stop and talk about real quick about corrosive and what happened in Flint. You can correct me a little bit on the science, but when I think about the terms corrosive and leaching, what's happening is, in this case, chloride is sort of grabbing chemicals off the inside of a pipe and sort of then freeing them up from the metal and then putting it in the water.
right.
And what happened in Flint, a lot of people think, oh my gosh, lead was in the water supply of the city of Flint, Michigan. That's not what happened. They switched water supplies. The water supply was more corrosive. That meant that the water itself was able to chemically free up the lead in the pipes, which the pipes were already there,
Right.
but the water supply was then freeing up the lead, putting it in the water, and then it was being consumed by people. And the public health crisis was essentially a chemical interaction between the water supply and the lead that already existed in the pipes. And so you could have lead pipes. Yep. You run your water for 30 seconds, that water's not gonna, the lead's not gonna show up just because you're flushing it. But if you have chloride, it's sort of freeing up the lead in a bad way and putting it in your drinking supply. So just, that's, if I got that right, keep going.
No, that was perfect. That was very well said. It was perfectly said. Right. Thank you for clarifying that. Exactly. Then the other piece is corrosion. So this is the physical breakdown of the plumbing fixtures and pipes themselves by the chloride. And so this is a direct, really a direct attack, a physical attack on your plumbing infrastructure of your home. So rust, corrosion, and so piping fails. Very common problem with hot water heaters having to be replaced frequently, dishwashers becoming inoperable. So real pocketbook issues for people with very high chloride in their water that are on their own water supply are frequently having to replace their appliances. So it's a serious pocketbook issue. If they're not replacing appliances, they're replacing very expensive filters on their reverse osmosis system or their ion exchange treatment system. So they're being forced. So it's not only health, it's serious out-of-pocket expenses for being able to live in their house and be able to wash their dishes and take a shower and do their laundry.
Yeah, I was interviewing somebody who lived near a salt pile. So not what we're talking about, where road salt's running off the road, but a concentrated salt pile that had gotten in the groundwater, and their pipes in their walls were bursting on a fairly regular basis. And if you've ever had that happen, you know how terrible it is. And if you haven't, what's happening is water is pouring in the exterior of your home. You might not even detect it until you see the watermarks or until the floor is flooding. And then you have mold, then you have to get a new wall, then you have to get new pipes. I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars in physical damage on top of, if you happen to have a lead pipe, you've been drinking this stuff for, you don't know how long. So and we'll take questions in a minute, but Dan, talk about, if you can, salt storage. DOT has known about this. There were early guidelines. I found some court case from the 1970s. So they knew, hey, if we pile a bunch of salt somewhere, that salt, in an uncovered storage area, that salt could run off, get in people's well water. They knew about that. And there's been, I think, a fairly gradual and fairly expensive effort, I think, by the state to cover salt piles, put concrete under the salt that they're storing. I don't know that every town in every part of the state is there yet, but we're getting pretty close, if we're not there already. What about that, what we're talking about, the salt running off the road? Has DOT acknowledged, hey, yeah, we're to blame for this and we need to do something about it? Or where's DOT right now?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Ryan. I think so. Just related to the salt storage first, there are actually grants available from the state to help municipalities get the cover their salt, which is great. That's so wonderful that that's happening. So yeah, so the DOT, so we first, prior to this well study, we published in the peer-reviewed journal study of surface water, where we looked at it, and there's a couple of slides. We don't have to look at them necessarily. But we were able to show statistically and very convincingly that the salt concentrations, the higher salt concentrations in lakes in the Adirondacks were correlated with state highways. So meaning more state highway in the watershed for the water body, more salt was found in the lake. And when we try to look at that same relationship with local highways, we didn't find anything because, as I said earlier, the local highways are sanded with a little bit of salt versus all state highways are salted. So the state acknowledged, they accepted, DOT did accept that data. And as one of the results of the outcomes of that was they've slowed down their trucks. So they're now their speed is 25 miles per hour, which the slower they drive, the more salt actually going to stay on the road versus bounce off the shoulder.
Because you're going faster, right? Let's real quick physics lesson. You're going faster. The salt's coming out faster. It's bouncing off. There's been studies that show that 20 to 30% of salt at certain speeds automatically bounces off the road, goes under the shoulder, runs off into the watershed, into a well, into a stream, whatever's nearby. Okay.
Right, exactly. So the DOT started engaging with us after we published that work and started to test new ideas and slow their trucks down. And so they've acknowledged they've acknowledged the problem. They also within their own regulations have language that gives the commissioner discretion to compensate people who have been impacted by salt. So meaning that they will on occasion pay to have someone's well re-drilled. And that's happened, for example, in Lake Clear in a couple of instances. You know, they've done work up in Dannemora, up in Shazy area. They've paid for actually municipal water to be brought from the town of Dannemora to Shazy. So they do admit that they're a source of this essentially this pollution to groundwater by virtue of changing some of their practices and also compensating individual homeowners when in fact they can be convinced that their salt contamination is from salting of state roads.
But it's pretty mixed. So in Dannemora, that was a salt storage pile, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And there was a pretty big not legislative, but pretty big political push there. Mm-hmm. Former congressman got involved, local officials, I think lawyered up, some very active, a woman, ironically, her name is Cheryl Saltmarsh, was one of the worst victims. And her late partner really got involved, got the community organized, got everybody tested in that area, found I think 18 homes with high sodium or chloride or both levels, and got the state. At one point, one of the local officials up there told me the state was thinking about buying everybody out. They didn't know what to do, and they were thinking about buying every home and sort of getting rid of the problem that way. But eventually they put in that water line, which actually gets us to a question: what can citizens do to get the state to take appropriate action to reduce salting of roads? There's legislation. Can you talk a little bit about that, Dan, and about what that does and doesn't do? And if DOT is taking this seriously, why does there need to be legislation to get them to study something that they've known about for decades?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a very challenging question. I mean, so as I mentioned earlier, the DOT has acknowledged the problem, and they are doing some incremental things to address the problem. One of these so we have this task force that the DOT currently chairs, and there are a couple of pilots. One is on Route 86 going from Lake Placid to Wilmington. The other one is down in Lake George on Route 9. And so the DOT's testing alternative practices on those pilots. And then there's a group of us that meet for them to share the information, for us to talk to them and offer suggestions. That particular process hasn't gone very well, to be frank. The meetings have been infrequent. The data is not forthcoming, and it's being run by the agency, by that agency. So this is where the legislation comes in and is so important. What the legislation does is essentially forms a Adirondack Park Road Salt Reduction Task Force. And this task force is made up of multiple agencies and interest groups and scientists and practitioners that all have an equal seat at the table, so we can have an honest, open discussion about this challenging environmental issue, but also a challenging environmental issue, challenging public health issue, and a challenging road safety issue. It's like a challenging issue. So we need to have a big tent, so to speak, to be able to talk about it openly. Right now, that's not happening because the DOT chairs the only group, and they have all their people on the group. It's not well represented by other groups, and so it's very difficult to have a honest, open, creative conversation about what we can do to meet the needs of the driving public in terms of safety and expectation, but also meet our obligation to protect clean water and also to protect human health. So that's why we're very excited, the we being all of us that have worked together for years to advance this cause. We're very excited that both the Assembly and the Senate legislatures have passed this as a bipartisan legislation. The Randy Preston road salt reduction bill, named after Randy, who for us was the icon of the symbol of trying to tackle this problem here in the Adirondacks. So we're thrilled to have gotten this far, and we're hoping, expecting that the governor will sign this legislation and allow us to work together as stakeholders in the Adirondacks to come up with a better way, a better plan to manage our winter roads without compromising safety, but also without compromising our health and our environment.
And real quick on another task force, do you think, so the governor would need to sign this, past the Assembly and the Senate, the governor would need to sign this. If he did, is this the sort of task force that they write a report and nobody follows it, or do you think it's a toothy, detailed report that somebody might actually take seriously?
So we're hoping it's the second one.
Right.
Because you're right. I mean, a task force is easy, right? We made a task force and then the document gets shelved. But no, the full expectation is what comes out of the task force essentially to be a new manual. How are we going to manage our roads in the Adirondacks? And we're picking the Adirondacks specifically as a case study for the state of New York. So we're hoping that the recommendations of the task force will gradually bleed out, and the practices that we come up with will gradually bleed out to the rest of the state, because this isn't a blue line, inside the blue line problem. This is a statewide problem. But we're going to have very specific recommendations coming out of the task force, and then the real work will begin, where to keep that as a document that lives and actually guides change at the state level. There's already change happening at the local level. Our local municipalities have been very proactive and working on implementing a lot of best practices at the local level to see real positive changes in their salt application rates. We just want the state to do the same thing.
That sort of answers one question we had. Is any training being provided to town and county highway departments to minimize the use of road salt? It seems like some are taking it seriously, using new technology, particularly I think around Lake George.
Mhm.
Somebody else asked, what about salt alternatives? And what is the cost difference between salt and an alternative? What is an alternative to salt? And then maybe go into, is it practical? Does it clear the road? And then what does it cost?
Yeah, so we're talking about alternatives. So we're talking about chemicals. And anything that will dissolve in water will melt ice. So it's wide open in terms of what could be used. But in terms of the practical alternatives, so there are what are called the chloride-based deicers or salt. So sodium chloride is the naturally occurring one, rock salt. There's calcium chloride and there's magnesium chloride. Those are the three chlorides. There's also blends of them, but those are the three. And so the difference between those three is sodium chloride is the only one that's naturally occurring in abundance. So New York State has the largest salt mines in North America, underground. Syracuse used to be the salt city, the Saltine Warriors before the Orangemen. So New York is a salt state, and so it's scooped out of the ground. That's one reason why it's so inexpensive. These other alternatives are manufactured to a large extent, so it costs a lot of money to make these chemicals. They are more effective, so meaning that sodium chloride or rock salt loses its ability to melt ice and snow very rapidly as it cools down. So meaning a 1 pound of rock salt or sodium chloride at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so right at freezing point, can melt about 46 pounds of ice. That same pound of salt at like 15 degrees Fahrenheit can only melt 6 pounds of ice. So the effectiveness of the salt of sodium chloride drops dramatically as the pavement temperature cools down. These other deicers are more effective at lower temperatures. So calcium, magnesium chloride, they also lose their effectiveness by a much slower rate than sodium. So what's often done is they blend them. So they'll pre-wet the sodium chloride with a spray, a brine of calcium, magnesium chloride, which increases the effectiveness and the melting effectiveness of the sodium chloride at lower temperatures. So that is what's done largely. And if you look at a salt truck, I always look at them, you'll notice the state ones, they have these tanks these big Nalgene tanks on the side of them, and those are full of these liquids that they spray. There's these nozzles around the chute where the salt comes out, and they're spraying the salt or pre-wetting the salt before it goes down. Also helps it stick to the road, so you get salt sticks to the road instead of bounces off the road, and it increases effectiveness in terms of melting and working at lower temperatures. Those are the things that are done, and there's a whole science. This is the whole science behind it. We could talk for hours about it. There are other alternatives too. They're a little more concerning. So you can use. You've heard of people using brine, brewer's yeast, or whatever they call it, not yeast, but whatever the stuff is from the brewing vats, beet juice. All these
cheese
organic
curds in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Yeah. So the problem with those sources, so those are all liquids, and brining is a good practice, but those are organic. Those are that's food you're putting on the road for later when it gets into the stream, and you're really charging up the biological activity in the water. So for every idea, there's a negative. A counterpoint to the idea, but there are alternatives, and that's the purpose. One of the purposes of the task force is to explore all these alternatives and think about, okay, what is reasonable, what can we use, in addition to slowing down. Your point you made earlier, Ryan, about what happens out west. Maybe we bring a little bit of that Western philosophy of road use and expectation to the east.
The point about sand, which we used to use and sometimes still use, it can clog culverts, it can get in the waterways, create sandbars that impedes fish and other wildlife from sort of moving around in the water. We got a question, a sort of technical question, which I'll add to actually. It says, regarding well construction, are you recording aquifer type, bedrock, glacial, alluvial sand, sort of trying to figure out, your testing, and this is a methodology question. What is the correlation with salt occurrence and aquifer type and well depth? And I'll add to that, state roads tend to be bigger. Is that, is it purely the amount of salt going on them, or is it the sort of nature of the road itself too? I mean, how do we, sort of, what are you testing for? What are you factoring in when you pinpoint the state as a culprit?
Yeah, so the first point about, so folks who participated in our survey, again, it's a little over 500, they were all provided with a questionnaire. And that questionnaire asked them a variety of questions about their water. So the first was, how deep is your well? The second was, how is your well constructed? Cased, uncased, screened, unscreened. What type of formation does your well tap into? Is it tapping into an aquifer? Is it in bedrock? So a variety of questions to get at what the person is referring to in terms of other factors that may be impacting or helping to explain the results that we found. In addition to that, we asked them about their water treatment systems, what are they using to treat their water, and when they sampled, so they were told to bypass their system, so flush their system for 5 minutes, actually turn on all their taps in their house for 5 minutes, so they're pulling water from their well, and then to bypass their water treatment system, so they're only sampling well water. So that was one thing, and then so in terms of looking at these other ideas, other explanations for the data that we have, besides the road network, what's interesting, what was telling from the survey is most people don't know much about their well. So meaning they don't know where it is, they don't know how deep it is, they don't know when it was built. That's a problem. So I think one thing I tell people is, if you're on well water, you should know where your well is. You should know everything about it. You should have it tested frequently, just as a health advisory. But in terms of other explanations for the result that we found, just as a general statistical a probability response, there's no correlation between the type of well, so is it cased, uncased, or the depth of the well, deep or shallow, or the type of system the well tapped into, bedrock or aquifer, and the type of road that the well is associated with. So meaning that state roads, wells that are along state roads aren't all the deep wells, or aren't all the shallow wells, right? So that would be a statistical impossibility. So the difference that we see in the water, the water is a function of the runoff coming from the roads, not a function of the types of wells that were built. If it was a function of the type of well, what you're saying is wells are different. Wells are constructed differently when they're built upslope from state roads or built downslope from state roads, and wells that are constructed downslope of local roads, and that's just not a possibility. It doesn't make any sense. We don't see any. We did look at well depth. We did hypothesize that shallower wells would be more contaminated than deeper wells, and also wells that were in aquifers, what we call unconfined aquifers, the ones that can receive water directly from the surface, would be more contaminated than ones that are in bedrock. And we found no such correlation. We found wells, deep wells were as equally contaminated as the shallow ones. Wells in bedrock were as equally contaminated as wells in unconfined aquifers, which is troubling. So you think about the implication of that result is that groundwater, that unconfined aquifers are much more rapidly flushed because the water is coming down in there and flushing them out.
Confinement, we're talking about an aquifer that's sort of contained in a geological formation of some kind.
But its flushing can replace its water in the order of hundreds of years. Wells that are tapping into fractures in bedrock, that water has been there for thousands of years. And so meaning that if you have that water is contaminated with salt, it's thousands of years for that salt to flush out. And the deeper the well, the longer the time it's going to take to flush out. So what this means is that this contamination is something that's going to be around for a long time, even if we stop using salt, and certainly will just get worse as their application rates continue to be the same.
So I have a couple of questions from email that I don't want to leave out here. This one is for you, Rye, I believe. Are there any developments in finding the source of the sodium contamination of the village of Saranac Lake wells?
Not as far as I know. So there was elevated salt detected in the village's water supply. We talked to a number of people, including the village, the head of the village drinking water system. I talked to people from the U.S. Geological Survey, DOT. Everybody said, we don't know where this is coming from. We don't know if it's an anomaly. We don't know if we tested wrong. We don't know if road salt is getting into the water supply. And I wrote that a couple of months ago. I've heard nothing since, which is somewhat troubling. Let me check off another question. Do we know about whether fracking byproduct was used in the Adirondacks? I think the answer is no. I asked DOT months and months ago for records to show whether it's no or not, and haven't gotten anything back. Somebody also asked about legal liability. And in some cases, DOT will admit that they've done something and compensate somebody. We don't know how often that happens. DOT hasn't replied. In other cases, DOT will admit that they likely contaminated somebody's water supply, said, see us in court. Their defense, to check off one other question, is, well, we have an obligation to serve the driving public. If in the course of doing that, we contaminate somebody's water, that's tough, is essentially their legal argument, which in addition to some sort of statutory technicalities that insulate the state, which we've written about, have largely gotten them off the hook in almost every lawsuit I've reviewed. Other questions, Tracy, any other comments? Dan, sorry, wanted to get through as many questions as I could right there.
There is one more in here, Dan, that's kind of interesting. How long before the salt supply runs out in New York State?
Ooh, that's a great one. We have a lot. So yeah, these huge salt deposits in the mines, that they go out underneath the Great Lakes. I can't answer that question. I'm sure it's not inexhaustible, but it's a tremendous geological formation. It's an old seabed. So I don't know the answer to that question. I imagine there's a lot left. Great one though.
And do you have anything else to add, just to the sort of lightning round we just did? Yeah,
we just kind of back. So the comment about the village water. So the village of Saranac Lake, for folks that that don't know, the village. So I live in the village of Saranac Lake, and when I moved to Saranac Lake in 2004, the village drew their water supply from Mackenzie Pond, which is the surface supply, and there was issues with that because the surface water has organic matter in it that when they treat the water, it actually forms this regulated chemical called haloacetic acid. So they had to switch the groundwater. So when they have these wells that are drilled, and so we're all in well water now, and so they recently tested and they found the sodium concentration was was above 20 parts per million. Unlike the private well owners like, oh, darn it, the village is regulated. So they're actually, this is a regulation, they have to deal with this problem. And so, but the question is, I think it's a fascinating question, is where is this salt coming from? And it's actually it's a fairly easy answer to a process of elimination. If someone would first just bypass their treatment system and sample the water directly from the well and see if that water actually has the same concentration of sodium in it as the water that they're pulling after treatment, then in fact, yeah, their groundwater's got elevated sodium. My question was to them, they're using sodium hypochlorite as their disinfectant. And so if they're sampling after treatment, then that sodium could very well be coming from the treatment. So that was the question that I had is are they sampling before treatment or after treatment? If it's after treatment, it's like, well, it's coming from the treatment. In which case they could just dial down the treatment a little bit and be below the threshold. If it's coming from before, that means there's high salt in the groundwater or elevated salt in the groundwater. And then the question there is, okay, where could it be coming from? But I think the first thing I would do if I was asked is I would sample the well directly. And I don't know if that's been done.
I don't either. You know, we've been looking, as we've seen, your research shows in individual wells, you can find a pretty good correlation, that's almost perfect in some cases, between road salt application and contamination of the drinking water supply. And DOT can sort of potentially ignore, potentially sort of compensate in little ways in a private well owner, but a sort of nightmare scenario, I think, for DOT is contaminating a village water supply, because then you have one government suing another government potentially and saying, you really got to do something. And
Right.
Then we're talking serious money.
Yeah, it's a totally different discussion at that point.
Right.
So I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And then I want to put a quick poll up just to ask everybody what is a good time for our next webinar about our coverage in the Adirondack Explorer. So there's one question just asking, what are our state representatives doing anything about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And our state representatives are very engaged. I mean, I've had a number of meetings with our representatives. Even the chair of the transportation committee down in Albany, down in Syracuse, Magnarelli. So the legislation that was passed was fully bipartisan. So Billy Jones introduced it in the assembly. It was Dan Steck, Billy's a Democrat, Dan Steck's Republican. They paired up on it. You know, Betty Little worked with Kaminsky and who's the chair of the ENCOM committee. So it's
She's
fully
a Republican, he's a Democrat.
Yeah. So very much. So the legislators, I think they've done their part. They see this as a critical issue. You know, their constituents. I know Billy had a lot of testimony from folks in his district that have suffered from contamination of their wells, and this is a social justice issue for. You know, these aren't rich people. The people living in these trailers and homes along these roads up in, you know, in rural Franklin County, Clinton County, don't have a lot of recourse. And so for them, it's social justice. And I think, the legislators have really stepped up and signed this legislation. And then so we're hopeful that, that the governor, signs it and lets that task force form up and do its job.
Well, thank you again, Rye and Dan. This was really informative, and really appreciate your time. And thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. I am going to put up a quick poll just to ask about timing for our next webinar. So,
And one other thing, Dan, there are a couple questions about where can people find your research? Do they need to subscribe to an academic journal, or is it posted somewhere that they could easily get to?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's one of it's on my board back here, is to have a better website. But they can go to adkwatershed.org. Our website is to have some information on there that folks can look at. The papers are there. We actually have, I think on we have a YouTube channel where there's some presentations that people can look at. We hosted a road salt workshop here at the college, sponsored by Cloud Splitter and ADK Action a number of years ago, and all those talks are on there that are really interesting. They talk about, you know, one of the things that the state brings up, the DOT, is liability, and so we had a lawyer talk through the whole liability issue, and that was really fascinating. So folks can go to the YouTube channel and see those videos. They can go to our website and see some information there. And actually, there'll be, if folks are interested, Thursday evening, so we have Water Week going on, and Thursday evening, Brendan Wiltsey will be giving a talk on road salt contamination in the Mirror Lake watershed in Lake Placid at 7 p.m. And so I would encourage people to go to tune into his webinar and learn specifically about what's going on in Mirror Lake, which is very interesting because Mirror Lake is like our urban lake in the Adirondacks. So most of our lakes are pretty rural, but it'll be a fascinating talk, and he'll touch on a lot of the same points I did, but a much higher level and really tied into Mirror Lake.
And final thing, somebody asked, can you get sodium out of water? It's reverse osmosis. It's very energy intensive. It's very expensive for an individual homeowner.
Yeah.
Very, very expensive. Yeah. And then you have, because you're creating a brine, you're removing salt from some of the water, you create a brine. In addition to the drinkable water, it's usually a 50-50 ratio, pretty pure drinkable water, very salty brine that you have to discharge somewhere, which becomes a complication. And you're not going to know you have a salt problem unless you test for it when you buy a home, or if you're testing for it as you have a well. And my understanding from some homeowners is the sort of standard, I'm buying a new house, well water test focuses on microbial problems, not mineral problems, because the Adirondacks are considered, the water here is considered so pure that nobody would think that there would be a mineral problem. But salt, as we've learned, is a big problem.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, I'd like to, if we're kind of wrapping up, I'd like to kind of then thinking about, we've been talking about salt, road salt, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of reflect about the Adirondacks and why the park was formed. The Adirondack Park was formed to protect water. And so that back in those days, in the 1800s, we had large land clearing for timber, for mining, for farming, and there was tremendous erosion and loss of soil. And there was a great concern about the ability of the soil to hold water and to provide water. So the Adirondacks was formed to protect that. And so the Adirondacks is about protecting clean water. And so if you think about, so salt is a threat to that. The original intent of the Adirondacks was to protect clean water. We're talking about a threat to that original intent. And so I think the narrative is yeah, we're talking about salt, but ultimately we're talking about water and protecting clean water for our environment, for recreational users of our water, and for, most importantly, for everybody that drinks our water and needs it for our very livelihoods, for our survival.
Thank you, Dan. That is a perfect note to end on. And thank you all for being here. And we'll see you again with another event in September.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.